Mid-12th Century, Woolpit, Suffolk, England. Two children with green skin crawled out of wolf-catching pits during harvest, speaking a language no scholar in England could identify. The girl survived to marry into society and revealed they came from a land of eternal twilight where the sun never rose. But she could never explain how they crossed into our world. What happened in the darkness between one reality and another that erased their memory but left their skin the color of deep forest moss? The wolf pits outside Woolpit village were dug deep into the Suffolk earth, 6 feet down with wooden stakes at the bottom. Farmers had built them generations ago to trap the gray wolves that once prowled these fields. By the middle of the 12th century, most wolves were gone, but the pits remained, covered with branches and leaves, all waiting like open mouths in the ground. During harvest season, when the wheat grew tall and golden under the English sun, workers spread across the fields with their curved blades, cutting and gathering. The air smelled of cut grain and dry earth. Sweat ran down their faces. Their hands moved fast because winter was coming and every stalk mattered. Then someone heard crying. Not the crying of a hurt animal or a lost sheep. This was different. This was the sound of children weeping, high and thin and desperate, coming from the direction of the old wolf pits near the forest edge. The reapers stopped their work. They looked at each other. Children did not play near the wolf pits. Everyone in Woolpit knew to stay away from those holes. The crying continued, rising and falling like a song of pure fear. 3 men walked toward the sound, their boots crushing the stubble left behind from cutting. When they reached the nearest pit, they stopped. They stared down into the darkness. At the bottom, pressed against the earthen wall, were 2 small figures, a boy and a girl. But their skin was wrong. Even in the shadows of the pit, even covered in dirt and tears, their skin glowed with a color that should not exist on human flesh. It was green, not pale or sickly, not the yellow-green of someone about to vomit. Pure green, like spring leaves or fresh moss after rain. The color covered every inch of their exposed skin, their faces, their hands, their bare feet. The children looked up at the men staring down at them and screamed words that made no sense at all. The men pulled them out using ropes. When the children stood in full daylight, the reapers stepped back. The green was even brighter in the sun. It seemed to shimmer. The girl looked about 8 years old. The boy was younger, maybe 5 or 6. Both wore clothes made from fabric no one recognized, woven in a way that seemed strange and foreign. The colors were odd too, not the browns and grays that English peasants wore. The children clung to each other and sobbed, their eyes squeezed shut against the brightness. They kept saying the same words over and over, words that sounded like nothing the farmers had ever heard, not French, not Latin, not the old Saxon tongue that grandmothers still spoke in the villages. Something else entirely. Someone ran to fetch Sir Richard de Calne. He was the local knight, the man who settled disputes and kept order in this part of Suffolk. When he arrived on horseback, still wearing his riding gloves, he dismounted and walked slowly toward the children. They shrank away from him, pressing against each other. Sir Richard knelt down, making himself smaller, less frightening. He spoke to them in English, then in French, then in the few Latin phrases he knew. The children just stared at him with wide, terrified eyes and replied in their impossible language. Their voices were thin from crying. The girl kept touching her brother's face, checking him, making sure he was still there. Sir Richard made a decision. He could not leave them in the field. He could not send them away to wander the roads. Whatever they were, wherever they came from, they were children, and they were afraid. He told his servants to bring them to his house. The servants wrapped them in cloaks because the children were shivering despite the warm afternoon. When they tried to lift the boy, he screamed and fought until they let his sister hold his hand. They walked together through the village, the green children and their escort of normal-skinned men and women, while everyone who saw them stopped and stared and whispered prayers. At Sir Richard's house, the servants prepared food, fresh bread, still warm, milk in wooden cups, cold meat from yesterday's dinner, apples from the orchard. They set it all on a table and gestured for the children to eat. The children looked at the food like it was poisonous. The girl picked up the bread, sniffed it, and dropped it. She said something sharp in her language and pushed the plate away. The boy started crying again. They tried everything: honey, cheese, cooked vegetables, raw vegetables, fish. Every time, the children refused. They turned their heads away. They wrapped their arms around their stomachs and wept. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky. The children would not eat. Servants whispered in corners. Some said the children were demons. Others said they were fairies from the old stories, creatures from under the hills who sometimes stole human babies. A few wondered if they were survivors of some disaster, refugees from a village that had burned or been attacked, their skin changed by smoke or poison or disease. But no one could explain the language. England in the 12th century saw travelers from many lands, merchants from the continent, pilgrims heading to holy sites, soldiers returning from wars. Every village had someone who had heard French or German or the languages of the Mediterranean. This was none of those. This was something completely unknown. On the second day, the children still refused to eat. They were growing weaker. The boy could barely stand. Sir Richard's wife brought them different foods, anything she could think of. Then one of the servants came in, carrying vegetables from the garden, including fresh, broad beans still in their green pods. The girl's head snapped up. She lunged forward and grabbed the beans. She tore open a pod with her fingers and shoved the raw beans into her mouth. The boy crawled over and did the same. They ate the beans with desperate hunger, stuffing them in so fast they nearly choked. When the pods were empty, they looked around wildly for more. The servants ran to the garden and brought back every bean plant they could find. The children ate them all, raw and uncooked, pod and bean together. They ate until their stomachs were full, and then they fell asleep on the floor, curled together like animals. Days became weeks. The children ate nothing but raw beans. Slowly, very slowly, they began to accept other foods. First cooked beans, then other vegetables, eventually bread and meat. And as their diet changed, something else changed too. The green color in their skin began to fade. It happened so gradually that no one noticed at first. But after a month, the boy's hands looked less like leaves and more like the pale skin of any English child. The girl's face started to lose its strange glow. They were becoming normal, but the boy was sick. He coughed constantly. He had no strength. Even as the green faded, he grew weaker and thinner. Sir Richard called for a priest to baptize them both, to save their souls in case the worst happened. The priest came and performed the ceremony, speaking Latin over their bowed heads, marking them with holy water. The children did not understand what was happening. They sat quietly, because the adults seemed to want them to. A few weeks later, the boy died. No one knew exactly why. He just faded away like a candle burning down to nothing. They buried him in the churchyard with a Christian burial. The girl screamed for 3 days. She would not eat. She would not sleep. She just screamed in her language until her voice went hoarse, and then she screamed silently, her mouth open, her green-tinted face wet with tears. But children are strong in ways adults are not. The girl survived. She learned to live without her brother. And slowly, word by word, she began to learn English. At first, just simple things: bread, water, yes, no. Then more complex ideas. The servants taught her. Sir Richard's children played with her. Month by month, the strange language faded from her mouth and English took its place. Her skin turned completely normal, pale and pink like any English girl. She looked like she belonged, but she remembered. And when she finally had enough words to explain, when the adults gathered around her and asked the question everyone had been asking since the day she climbed out of the wolf pit, she told them a story that made no sense at all. She told them about a place called the Land of St. Martin, where the sun never shone and everything existed in twilight. She told them about following the sound of bells through a dark passage and emerging suddenly into blinding light. She told them these things in clear English with a serious face. And she could not explain, no matter how many times they asked, how she had traveled from that twilight world to the wolf pits of Woolpit. The memory was there, but the path was gone, erased like footprints in snow after a storm. The girl lived in Sir Richard de Calne's house for several years, growing from a frightened child into a young woman. During those years, she answered questions. Priests visited. Scholars traveled from monasteries to speak with her. Local lords came out of curiosity. Everyone wanted to know about the land she described, the place she called St. Martin's Land. She told the same story every time, never changing the details, speaking with the confidence of someone describing their own bedroom. In that land, she said, there was no bright sun like the one that hurt her eyes when she first arrived in Woolpit. Instead, everything existed in a kind of permanent dusk, a soft gray light that never became full day, but never turned to complete night either. She remembered the color green everywhere: green fields, green clothes, green animals. Whether this meant everything was actually green, or whether her memory had painted it that color, no one could tell. She described tending flocks of animals in those green fields. Sheep, she thought, though they might have been different from English sheep. She was young when she left, maybe 6 or 7 years old. Her brother was even younger. Their job was to watch the animals and keep them from wandering. It was simple work that children did in every farming village across England and across the world. There was nothing magical about it. They walked behind the animals. They threw stones to turn them back when they strayed. They sat in the grass when the animals grazed peacefully. It was an ordinary childhood in an extraordinary place. Then one day she heard bells. The sound came from somewhere distant, echoing across the fields. The bells sounded like the ones she would later hear at St. Edmund's Abbey, the great monastery that stood a few miles from Woolpit. Deep bronze bells that rang for prayer times, calling monks to worship. In her land of twilight, those bells seemed to call her too. She told her brother to follow. They left the animals and walked toward the sound. She could not explain why she felt compelled to follow it. Children do not always know why they do things. The bells rang, and she walked, and her brother walked beside her, holding her hand. They came to a cave or a tunnel entrance. The details grew fuzzy here. She remembered darkness. She remembered walking into the earth, following the sound of bells that echoed off stone walls. She remembered her brother's hand in hers, small and warm. She remembered walking for a long time, long enough that her legs hurt, and she wanted to stop, but the bells kept pulling her forward. The darkness was complete. She could not see her own feet. She felt her way along rough walls that scraped her fingers. The air smelled like wet stone and earth. Cold air moved past her face. The bells grew louder and then softer and then louder again, as if the tunnel twisted and turned. Then suddenly, without warning, there was light. Blinding, painful, a white light that stabbed into her eyes like knives. She screamed and covered her face. Her brother screamed too. They stumbled forward out of the darkness and fell onto grass. Real grass, she insisted, not the green grass of her home, but different grass, rougher and browner. When she finally forced her eyes open against the terrible brightness, she saw a sky more blue than anything she had ever seen. The sun, that burning yellow circle, hung in that blue like a wound. It hurt to look at. Everything hurt. The colors were too strong. The sounds were too loud. Birds sang with voices that seemed to shout. Wind rushed past her ears. She grabbed her brother and they ran, looking for shade, looking for darkness, looking for anything familiar. They found the wolf pit, or rather, they fell into it. They were running blind, hands over their eyes, and the ground just disappeared under their feet. They fell 6 feet down onto packed earth, landing hard enough to knock the breath from their lungs. When they could breathe again, they huddled together in the blessed dimness at the bottom of that hole and cried. They cried until their voices gave out. They cried until the strange men came and pulled them up into the painful light. That was her story. That was all she remembered. Scholars asked careful questions. How long did you walk in the tunnel? She did not know. Time felt different in the dark. It could have been hours or days. Did you bring food? No. Did you drink water? She could not remember. Were there other tunnels branching off? Maybe. She was not sure. Could you find the entrance again? No. She had tried to remember, but the memory would not come clear. It was like trying to remember a dream after waking. The harder she tried to see it, the more it slipped away. Where exactly was St. Martin's Land? She did not know. Beyond the tunnel, beyond the darkness, somewhere else. Some scholars suggested she came from a real place with a real name that she had misunderstood as a child. Perhaps there was a village dedicated to St. Martin somewhere in England or France or the Low Countries. Perhaps she had lived there and some disaster had forced her family to flee. Perhaps she and her brother had gotten separated from their parents and wandered into caves or mine tunnels. Perhaps the green skin came from a disease, or from eating certain plants, or from living underground for a long time. These were reasonable explanations that turned mystery into simple tragedy. But they could not explain the language. They could not explain why no one ever came looking for 2 missing children. They could not explain how 2 small children could survive days or weeks in complete darkness without food or water. Other scholars took her story more literally. They believed in St. Martin's Land as a real place existing in a real but hidden location. Some said it lay far to the north, where the sun barely rose even at midday. Others pointed to stories from ancient books about lands beyond the edge of the world, where different rules applied. A few whispered about the older beliefs, the ones that existed before Christianity came to England. Stories about the good folk who lived under hills and sometimes stole human children or left their own children behind. Perhaps the green children had come from that other world, that fairy realm that existed alongside the human world but separate from it, touching it only at certain places and certain times. Sir Richard de Calne kept careful watch over the girl as she grew. He treated her well. She was not a servant, though she helped with household work. She was not quite family, though she ate meals with them and slept in a good bed. She existed in a strange middle space, neither guest nor servant nor relative. The green had completely faded from her skin by the time she turned 12 years old. Her hair was brown. Her eyes were brown. She looked entirely human and entirely English. But people who knew her story watched her carefully, looking for signs of difference, waiting for the strangeness to show itself again. She learned to read a little, which was unusual for a girl of her station. A visiting monk taught her, curious to see if someone from St. Martin's Land could learn the same way English children learned. She could. She learned quickly. She had a good memory for words and stories, but she could not remember a single word of her original language. Not one. It had vanished from her mind as completely as the green had vanished from her skin. When people asked her to speak the language she had used when she first arrived, she tried. She opened her mouth, and nothing came out. The sounds that had once flowed naturally from her tongue were gone, erased, replaced entirely by English. It was as if that part of her had died along with her brother. The years passed. The girl became a young woman. Historical records, the few that exist, suggest her name might have been Agnes, though this is not certain. What is certain is that she left Woolpit. She traveled 40 miles east to a town called King's Lynn, a busy port on the North Sea where merchants came and went, and a person with a strange past could disappear into the crowd. There she found work in the household of a man named Richard Barr. This was not a small thing. Richard Barr was an important man, an archdeacon of Ely, a high church official who also served as a royal judge under King Henry II. He was educated, powerful, and wealthy. For Agnes, the green girl from nowhere, to enter his household showed that she had learned to navigate English society successfully. Then something unexpected happened. Richard Barr married her. An archdeacon marrying was unusual, but not forbidden at that time. In a church, rules about priests and marriage were still changing in the 12th century. But for a man of his position to marry a woman with no family, no dowry, and a story about coming from a land of eternal twilight, that raised questions. What did he see in her? Did he believe her story? Did he marry her despite it or because of it? Did she tell him the truth before they wed or hide it? The records do not say. They were married, and that is all history knows for certain. After the marriage, Agnes disappeared from written history entirely. No chronicler mentions her again. No church record describes her children if she had any. No legal document references her death. She simply faded away, becoming invisible the way most medieval women became invisible, their lives unrecorded and forgotten. But two chroniclers, the two educated men who collected unusual stories from across England, did record the tale of the green children. They wrote it down decades after it happened, long after Agnes had vanished into her normal life. One chronicler was Ralph of Coggeshall. The other was William of Newburgh. Both were serious men, not storytellers or entertainers. They recorded history, and they considered this story important enough to preserve. William of Newburgh wrote his History of England between the years 1198 and 1220, roughly 50 to 70 years after the Green Children appeared. He was a careful writer who criticized other historians for including obvious lies and impossible tales in their work. Yet he included the Green Children in his history. He called the story prodigious and miraculous. He admitted that many people would doubt it. But he also wrote that the event had been vouched for by so many trustworthy witnesses that he could not simply ignore it. The story had spread too far. Too many people claimed it was true. He wrote it down and left it for future readers to judge. Ralph of Coggeshall wrote around the same time, and his version included slightly different details. The differences were small but significant. In his telling, the children said their land was called St. Martin's Land because that saint was worshipped there. The people of that land were Christians who built churches and rang bells for prayer. This made the place sound less like a fairy realm and more like a real Christian community somewhere in the world. But Ralph also included the detail about perpetual twilight, about a bright land visible across a river that the people of St. Martin's Land could see but never reach. This mixing of Christian details with impossible geography created a strange blend of the familiar and the fantastic. Both chronicles agree on certain facts: the green skin, the unknown language, the refusal to eat anything but beans, the boy's death, the girl's gradual recovery and integration into English life. These consistent details across two independent sources gave the story weight. If only one person had written it down, later scholars could dismiss it as invention or confusion. But two chroniclers, writing separately, agreed on the core facts. Something had happened in Woolpit. Two children had appeared. They were different. They could not explain where they came from. That much seemed certain. Over the following centuries, the story refused to die. It appeared in collections of wonders and strange tales. Historians mentioned it in passing when discussing the reign of King Stephen, or King Henry II. The village of Woolpit itself kept the memory alive through local tradition. Families told their children about the day the Green Children appeared. The story changed slightly with each telling, details shifting and transforming, but the core remained the same. Two green children, unknown language, no explanation. In 1610, a scholar named William Camden mentioned the Green Children in his Great Survey of Britain. By then, the story was 450 years old. Camden treated it as an interesting historical curiosity, something that had allegedly happened in the distant past. He noted the location and the basic facts, but offered no explanation. In the 1800s, folklorists and historians began collecting old tales and legends, trying to preserve them before they disappeared completely. The Green Children appeared in these collections alongside stories of ghosts and fairies and unexplained events. Some writers suggested the children had been Flemish refugees whose skin appeared green because of malnutrition. Others proposed they were the last remnants of some ancient British people who had survived in hidden valleys. The Flemish refugee theory gained support when researchers discovered that a battle had been fought near a place called Fornham St. Martin in the year 1173. The Battle of Fornham happened during a civil war when rebellious barons hired Flemish soldiers to fight against King Henry II. The king's forces won and slaughtered the Flemish mercenaries. Some historians suggested that peaceful Flemish settlers living near Fornham St. Martin might have been attacked during the violence. Perhaps two children fled into the Thetford Forest, a vast and dark woodland that covered much of that region. Perhaps they wandered lost in the forest for days. The thick trees would block out the sun, creating a kind of permanent twilight. The children might have eaten wild plants that stained their skin or made them sick. Their Flemish language would sound like gibberish to English peasants. When they finally emerged from the forest, frightened and starving, they could have fallen into the wolf pits near Woolpit. This explanation felt satisfying because it made sense. It turned the mystery into a tragedy that could be understood and explained. But it had problems. The Battle of Fornham happened in 1173. If the Green Children appeared during the reign of King Stephen, that would place them in the 1140s or 1150s, decades before the battle. Some scholars suggested the chroniclers had confused the dates or that the children appeared later than traditionally believed. Others pointed out that Flemish and English are not that different. An educated person in 12th century England would recognize Flemish or Dutch as similar to the Germanic languages they already knew. They would not describe it as completely unknown. The arsenic poisoning theory suggested that the children had been deliberately poisoned with arsenic compounds, which can turn skin greenish in high doses. Perhaps they were children of a murdered family, left to die but managing to escape. This explained the green skin and the sickness, but it did not explain the language or the story about St. Martin's Land. Why would poisoned children make up such a detailed and consistent story about a place of twilight? Children under stress and trauma usually withdraw or become confused. They do not invent elaborate mythologies. The malnutrition theory pointed to a condition called hypochromic anemia or chlorosis, sometimes called green sickness in the past. This condition, often caused by severe iron or vitamin deficiency, could give skin a faint greenish tint, especially in young people. The fact that the children's color faded as they ate better food supported this explanation. But chlorosis produces a subtle pallor, not the vivid green that made the medieval chroniclers use words like miracle and prodigy. And it still did not explain the language. Each explanation solved part of the mystery, but left other parts unexplained. The truth seemed to live in the space between all these theories, refusing to settle into any single answer. What frustrated modern investigators most was the lack of hard evidence. No bones to examine, no DNA to test, no artifacts from the children's clothing. No written records from Woolpit itself confirming that two strange children had lived there. Everything depended on the chronicles, and the chronicles were written decades after the fact by men who had not witnessed the events themselves. They were recording stories told to them by others. Yet the story carried details that felt authentic. The refusal to eat normal food, the desperate hunger for raw beans, the boy's sickness and death, the girl's gradual adaptation. These were not the kinds of details that appear in fairy tales or religious allegories. They were messy human details, the kind that come from real observation. When medieval writers invented stories to teach moral lessons, they made them clean and clear. The good were rewarded, the wicked were punished. Everything had a meaning. But the Green Children's story had no clear moral. The boy died for no reason. The girl survived and disappeared. There was no lesson about virtue or sin. It just happened, and then it was over. Some researchers suggested the story was an allegory, a fictional tale meant to represent something else. Perhaps it symbolized the Norman conquest of England, with the Green Children representing the conquered native British population forced to adapt to Norman culture. Perhaps it represented religious conversion, with the children moving from darkness into light, from paganism into Christianity. But if the chroniclers meant it as allegory, why did they present it as fact? Why did William of Newburgh specifically say he was recording it? Because so many witnesses had confirmed it? Allegories do not need witnesses. The legend grew stranger in modern times. In the 1970s, an astronomer named Duncan Lunan proposed the most unusual theory of all. He suggested the children might have come from another planet. I'd accidentally transported to Earth through some kind of dimensional portal or alien technology. The permanent twilight of St. Martin's Land could be a planet that was tidally locked to its sun, always showing the same face to its star, creating a band of eternal twilight between the bright side and the dark side. The journey through the tunnel could represent travel through a wormhole or portal. This theory sounded like science fiction. Most scholars ignored it, but it showed how the mystery had evolved over 800 years, growing to accommodate each new age's way of understanding impossible events. The girl herself, if she lived to old age, would have been in her 60s or 70s in the early 1300s. By then, the England she remembered from childhood had changed. New kings had ruled. New wars had been fought. The memory of her arrival would have faded in the minds of most people who had witnessed it. Perhaps she told her own children, if she had children, about the land of twilight and the darkness and the terrible light. Perhaps she kept silent, afraid of being labeled a liar or a witch. Perhaps she no longer believed it herself, wondering if it had all been a fever dream from a childhood trauma she could not quite remember correctly. Today, the village of Woolpit still exists in Suffolk, about 7 miles from the town of Bury St. Edmunds. It is a quiet place of old buildings and narrow roads. The wolf pits themselves are long gone, filled in centuries ago, as England became more settled and wolves disappeared from the land. But the village remembers. The village sign shows 2 green children standing beneath a tree. Local pubs and shops reference the legend. Tour guides bring visitors to see the church where the boy was supposedly buried, though no marker identifies his grave. The story has become part of the village's identity, something that makes Woolpit special and strange. In 1978, a local author named Bob Roberts researched the legend and interviewed longtime residents of Woolpit. He wrote that people in the village told him there were still descendants of the green children living among them, real people who could trace their family lines back to Agnes and her marriage to Richard Barre. But when Roberts asked who these descendants were, no one would tell him. They smiled and changed the subject. Whether this was true or just another layer added to an 800-year-old mystery, Roberts could not determine. The possibility hung in the air like morning mist, impossible to grasp, but also impossible to completely dismiss. The official status of the case, if it can be called a case, remains exactly what it was in the 12th century: unexplained, unverified, unresolved. No police investigated because there was no crime. No court examined evidence because there was no trial. 2 medieval chroniclers wrote it down and history preserved their words. That is all. Modern historians classify the story as folklore, a legend, a curious tale that probably contains some kernel of truth buried under centuries of embellishment and confusion. But they cannot prove this. They cannot point to the real events and say, here, this is what actually happened. What happened to the people involved tells its own story. The boy died young and was buried in Christian ground, his name forgotten, his origin forever unknown. The girl, Agnes, married into English society and vanished from the historical record. Sir Richard de Calne and his family continued their lives. The village of Woolpit survived wars and plagues and social changes, carrying the story forward through generations. The chroniclers who wrote it down died hundreds of years ago, their manuscripts copied and recopied by monks and scholars who found the story worth preserving even when they did not fully believe it. The case transformed how people thought about the unexplained. Before science offered explanations based on evidence and testing, medieval people lived in a world where the impossible could happen. Saints performed miracles. Demons tempted the faithful. Angels appeared to shepherds. Strange creatures lived in forests and deep waters. The green children fit into this worldview. They were prodigious and miraculous, but not necessarily unbelievable. As the centuries passed and the scientific method developed, the story became embarrassing to some scholars. It did not fit the new understanding of how the world worked. Children do not have green skin. Unknown languages do not exist. Lands of eternal twilight are impossible on Earth. The story had to be either dismissed as fiction or explained away with rational theories. But the story refuses to be either dismissed or explained. It sits in an uncomfortable place between history and legend, too well documented to ignore, but too strange to accept. Modern parallels exist. Stories of children who appear speaking unknown languages still circulate. Cases of feral children raised by animals. Cases of lost children who cannot remember where they came from. Cases of amnesia and trauma that erase identity. But none quite match the specific details of the green children. None combine the physical evidence with the linguistic mystery with the story of another land the way this case does. What we still do not know is almost everything that matters. We do not know if the children were real or invented. We do not know their true origin. We do not know what caused their green skin if they had it. We do not know what language they spoke or where it came from. We do not know how they arrived in Woolpit. We do not know if Agnes had children or if descendants really exist. We do not know why two serious historians thought this story deserved to be preserved. We do not know what happened in the darkness between St. Martin's Land and the wolf pits of Suffolk. The mystery connects to fundamental questions about how we know what we know. How do we distinguish between history and legend when both are preserved in written documents? How do we judge the reliability of witnesses we can never question? How do we explain events that do not fit our understanding of how the world works? The green children force us to confront these questions without giving us easy answers. They remind us that the past is not as clear as we pretend it is, that history is full of gaps and contradictions, and events that refuse to make sense no matter how carefully we examine them. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the story is how normal it became. A girl with green skin who spoke no known language and claimed to come from a land where the sun never shone, married into medieval English society and lived an ordinary life. She learned the language, she learned the customs, she became English. And then she disappeared into the enormous silence that swallows most human lives, leaving behind only her strange beginning and no explanation for how or why it happened. If something that impossible could occur and then fade into normalcy, what else might be happening that we explain away or forget or fail to notice? The philosophical question at the heart of this mystery is not whether the green children were real. It is whether we are capable of recognizing truth when it appears in forms we are not prepared to accept. Medieval chroniclers preserved this story because witnesses convinced them something extraordinary had occurred. Modern scholars doubt it because it conflicts with what we know about biology and language and geography. But what if both are right? What if something extraordinary did occur and our explanations are simply too limited to capture what really happened? The Green Children suggest that reality might be stranger and more flexible than we want to believe, that the boundaries between possible and impossible might be less solid than we need them to be for comfort. The children appeared. They were green. They spoke no known language. The girl survived and told her story. Then she faded into history and silence. These facts, if they are facts, remain. Everything else is interpretation and theory and wishful thinking. The truth, whatever it was, stayed locked in the mind of a medieval girl who learned to speak English but could never quite explain the darkness between one world and another. And now she is 800 years gone, and the answer went with her. What remains is the question, hanging in the air above Woolpit, like the bells that supposedly called her through the dark, ringing and ringing across centuries, with no one left alive who remembers what they meant or why they rang at all.